Hey there. Tonight we begin with a journey into the brutal reality of samurai warfare, where the romantic images of lone swordsmen dueling with elegant katana techniques dissolve before the historical truth of mounted archers shooting from horseback, of massed infantry formations clashing with spears and polearms, of siege warfare grinding through months of starvation and disease, and of combat that was far more chaotic, pragmatic, and varied than the stylized representations in films and popular culture suggest, from the primacy of the bow as the samurai's weapon of choice through most of their history, to the revolution that firearms brought to Japanese battlefields, from the importance of ashigaru foot soldiers whose role was systematically downplayed in later romanticized accounts, to the complex combined arms tactics that actually determined battle outcomes, from the psychological warfare and ritual challenges that preceded combat to the grim realities of what happened when formations clashed and when sieges dragged on for seasons. The story of how samurai actually fought reveals warriors who are simultaneously products of elaborate cultural codes and pragmatic professionals adapting to the tactical and technological realities of their times. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here. And let those comments know where the listening's happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about samurai combat, popular imagination immediately conjures images shaped by cinema. Warriors drawing katana in lightning-quick movements, engaging in one-on-one duels with exquisite swordsmanship, fighting with honour and grace even in the midst of deadly combat. These images owe more to Akira Kurosawa's artistic vision, and to the romanticized Bushido ideology developed in later peaceful periods, than to the historical reality of how samurai actually fought during Japan's centuries of near-constant warfare. The reality was simultaneously more complex and more brutal than popular representation suggest. Samurai were professional warriors whose primary purpose was winning battles and wars, not demonstrating aesthetic swordsmanship or adhering to codes that would handicap combat effectiveness. The warriors who survived and prospered were those who adapted to technological change, who understood combined arms tactics, who could effectively lead troops in complex maneuvers, and who were willing to use whatever methods and weapons would bring victory. The romance came later, during the peaceful Tokugawa period, when samurai became administrators and developed elaborate philosophies about a warrior past that was already being idealized and distorted. Picture this, a battlefield in 1560, perhaps during one of the many conflicts of the Sengoku period. Two armies face each other across rice fields. Not the handful of heroes that films depict, but thousands of men. The samurai are mounted, yes, but they are primarily armed with bows, not swords. Around them are masses of ashigaru, foot soldiers armed with long spears, organised in tight formations that bristle with overlapping weapon points. Behind the front lines are units equipped with arquebuses, primitive firearms that are crude but devastatingly effective. The battle begins not with honourable single combat, but with volleys of arrows darkening the sky, with arquebus shots creating smoke and thunder, with spear formations advancing in organised ranks. When individual samurai do engage in close combat, they're often grappling and stabbing with daggers, trying to immobilise opponents so they can take heads for later proof of their victories. It's violent, chaotic, and profoundly different from the choreographed sword duels of popular imagination. Tonight's journey explores how samurai actually fought, the weapons they primarily used, and how those weapons shaped tactics, the importance of mounted archery throughout most of samurai history, the crucial role of ashigaru infantry whose contributions were systematically minimized in later accounts, the realities of siege warfare that decided far more conflicts than open battles, the naval dimensions of Japanese warfare, the training methods that prepared warriors for actual combat rather than for aesthetic demonstration, the ways armour constrained and shaped fighting techniques, the psychological and ritual elements that were genuine parts of warfare, and the revolutionary impact of firearms that transformed Japanese battlefields in the 16th century. From the tactical realities to the cultural context that shaped them, the story reveals warriors who are far more complex, pragmatic, and adaptable than simplified modern representations suggest. The katana, the curved longsword that has become synonymous with samurai in popular culture, was actually a secondary weapon for most of samurai history, a backup to the primary weapons that dominated actual battlefields. Understanding the real weapons hierarchy and how different weapons were used reveals that samurai were far more versatile warriors than the katana-focused image suggests, adapting their arms to tactical situations and to technological developments, rather than fixating on a single weapon type. The bow was the primary weapon of the samurai for most of their history from their emergence in the Heian period through much of the Sengoku period. The term yumitori, literally bow wielder, was a title of honour for distinguished warriors, indicating that archery prowess defined elite warrior status. The samurai were mounted archers whose primary combat function was to ride into battle and shoot arrows at enemies from horseback or from prepared positions. The extensive training in archery that all samurai underwent from childhood reflected the bow's centrality to their military role. The yumi, the asymmetric Japanese longbow, was distinctive in design and difficult to master. The bow was constructed of bamboo and wood in composite layers, creating strong and flexible weapon that could shoot arrows with considerable force at substantial ranges. The asymmetric design with the grip positioned below centre allowed the bow to be used from horseback without the lower limb striking the horse. The length of the bow, often over 2 meters, provided power while requiring specialised technique to use effectively. The training required to become proficient with the yumi was extensive and began in early childhood. The drawing technique differed from European archery, with the bow being drawn past the ear rather than to the cheek, creating longer draw length and requiring different muscle development. The mounted archery particularly required extraordinary skill. Shooting accurately while controlling a horse, often while the horse was moving at speed, demanded years of practice. The abusame, horseback archery ceremonies that survive in modern Japan, preserve echoes of training methods that were once deadly serious preparation for warfare. The arrows used in warfare varied by purpose. The yanagi bar or willow leaf arrowheads were broad heads designed to cause maximum damage to unarmoured or lightly armoured targets. The armour-piercing arrows had narrow bodkin points designed to penetrate armour gaps or to pierce mail. The kaburaya, or whistling arrows, had hollow bulbs that created eerie sounds in flight, used for signalling, for psychological effect, or for ceremonial purposes like marking the official start of battles. The variety of arrow types allowed archers to adapt their ammunition to tactical situations. The effective range and power of yumi in skilled hands was considerable. Historical accounts mention effective combat ranges of 50 to 100 metres or more, with experienced archers able to shoot accurately at mounted or standing targets at these distances. The penetrating power was sufficient to pierce armour at close to medium ranges, making archery a genuinely deadly combat skill rather than merely harassment fire. The ability to shoot rapidly. Skilled archers could lose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, created substantial volume of fire from units of mounted archers. The spear or yari was probably the second most important weapon in actual combat, particularly as warfare evolved in the Sengoku period. The yari came in numerous varieties ranging from relatively short spears of 6 feet or so to extremely long spears of 12 feet or more. The longer varieties were particularly important for ashigaru formations, where ranks of spearmen created bristling walls of weapon points that were difficult for mounted warriors to penetrate. The shorter spears were more versatile weapons suitable for individual combat by mounted or unmounted warriors. The combat techniques with yari emphasised thrusting rather than slashing. The sharp points could penetrate armour gaps and could deliver fatal wounds with relatively little force if properly directed. The length of the spear gave reach advantage over swords, allowing spearmen to strike opponents before the swordsman could close to effective range. The defensive utility of spears in maintaining distance and in creating barriers was as important as their offensive capability. The naginata was a pole weapon with a curved blade that combined the reach of a spear with cutting capability. The weapon was particularly associated with sohei, warrior monks, and was later adopted by women of samurai families for defence of homes. In earlier periods, mounted warriors might use naginata in combat, using the weapon's reach and cutting power from horseback. The versatility of naginata made them effective against both mounted and unmounted opponents, with the curved blade being capable of severing limbs or delivering disabling cuts. The katana and tachi, the curved swords that are now most associated with samurai, served primarily as secondary or backup weapons through much of samurai history. The tachi was the earlier curved sword form, worn edge down, suspended from the belt, used primarily by mounted warriors. The katana developed later and was worn thrust through the belt with the edge upward, allowing faster draw. Both weapons were important for close combat when primary weapons were unavailable, broken, or inappropriate for the situation. But the popular image of samurai primarily fighting with swords doesn't match historical reality for most periods. The combat techniques with swords emphasized cutting rather than thrusting, though thrusts were certainly used when appropriate. The curved blade optimized cutting actions, with the curve allowing the blade to slice through targets rather than simply chopping. The two-handed grip provided power and control, though one-handed techniques existed for situations where one hand was occupied or injured. The relatively short length compared to European longswords reflected the weapon's role as close-quarters backup rather than primary battlefield weapon. The tanto, dagger or short sword, served crucial functions in close combat and in taking enemy heads. When grappling with opponents in armour, the tanto could be thrust into armour gaps, under the arm, behind the knee, into the face opening of helmets, to deliver killing or disabling wounds that longer weapons couldn't inflict in close quarters. The taking of enemy heads for later verification and reward required cutting through necks, a task for which the tanto was often more suitable than longer blades. The quality of blades varied enormously. The legendary Japanese swordsmiths did create blades of extraordinary quality for wealthy patrons, swords that combined hardness for edge retention, with flexibility for durability, that featured beautiful grain patterns from the differential hardening process, and that were effective cutting weapons. Yet the vast majority of weapons used in warfare were far more mundane. Mass-produced blades of adequate but not exceptional quality, sufficient for their purposes without being the masterwork blades that collectors now prize. The practical considerations of weapon choice in actual combat differed from peacetime status display. During warfare, pragmatic warriors used whatever weapons were most effective for specific situations, bows for ranged combat, spears for formation fighting, or for their reach advantage, swords for close combat when other weapons were unavailable. During peacetime, particularly during the long Tokugawa peace, the sword became primarily a status symbol, with the elaborate martial arts that developed emphasizing aesthetic qualities and philosophical dimensions that had limited relevance to actual battlefield combat. The introduction of firearms in the 16th century revolutionized weapon hierarchies and tactics, a development discussed more fully in later sections. The point here is that weapon usage was never static, but evolved continuously in response to tactical needs and technological opportunities. The samurai were adaptive professionals who used appropriate weapons for circumstances, rather than being romantic devotees of particular weapon forms. Understanding samurai weaponry reveals that the katana-centered image popular in modern culture reflects peacetime symbol rather than battlefield reality. The historical samurai were masters of multiple weapons, principally the bow, extensively the spear and pole weapons, and secondarily the sword, adapting their arms to tactical situations and to evolving military technology. The true martial skill of samurai lay not in obsessive perfection with single weapon type, but in versatile capability with multiple arms, and in the judgment to use appropriate weapons for specific combat situations. The romantic reduction of samurai to katana-wielding swordsmen diminishes their historical reality as pragmatic, adaptable warriors who succeeded through tactical flexibility rather than through aesthetic devotion to particular weapon forms. The horseback archery that was central to samurai warfare for centuries required extraordinary skill and determined the tactical patterns that characterized Japanese battles from the Heian period through much of the Sengoku period. Understanding mounted archery reveals both the technical mastery required and the tactical frameworks that elite mounted warriors created on battlefields. The development of mounted archery as the samurai's primary combat method emerged from the military needs of the Heian period, 794 to 1185, when regional warrior families consolidated power. The combination of horse and bow created mobile firepower that could dominate infantry, and that provided the basis for the military supremacy that warrior families established over the imperial court aristocracy. The mastery of mounted archery became the defining skill separating elite warriors from common soldiers. The horses used by samurai were smaller than modern war horses or European medieval destriers, typically standing 13 to 14 hands high, essentially large ponies by modern standards. Yet these horses were strong, agile, and well suited to Japanese terrain. The smaller size actually advantaged mounted archery by creating stable platforms that were closer to the ground, and by allowing the horses to navigate mountainous terrain and rice paddies that would challenge larger mounts. The breeding and training of war horses was serious business for samurai families, with distinguished bloodlines being carefully maintained. The riding style differed significantly from European mounted combat. The samurai used relatively short stirrups that positioned the rider in somewhat standing position, creating stability for archery while allowing the rider to absorb the horse's movements through flexing legs. The high-back saddle with prominent pommel and cantle provided additional support, essentially creating a platform from which the archer could shoot while managing the horse, primarily through leg pressure and weight shifts, since the hands were occupied with the bow. The shooting technique from horseback required coordination of multiple complex skills simultaneously. The archer needed to control the horse, select and nock arrows, draw the massive bow using proper form, aim while compensating for the horse's motion, and for arrow flight time to moving targets, and release smoothly to send arrows accurately toward enemies who were themselves often moving. The achievement of proficiency required beginning training in childhood and maintaining skills through continuous practice throughout a warrior's career. The tactical employment of mounted archers emphasized mobility and firepower rather than shock combat. Unlike European knights who often charged with lances in tight formation, Japanese mounted archers typically operated in looser formations, riding toward and around enemy formations while shooting arrows, then withdrawing before enemy could close to melee range. The mounted archery created ongoing attrition, whittling down enemy forces through continuous arrow fire from mobile platforms that were difficult for infantry to counter effectively. The kasagake and yabusame training exercises developed warrior skills in controlled settings. These practices involved riding at speed past targets and attempting to hit them with arrows. Kasagake used targets representing armor, while yabusame used wooden targets. The exercises developed the timing, coordination, and muscle memory necessary for combat effectiveness. The high degree of formalization these exercises acquired in later periods shouldn't obscure their original purpose as serious combat training for skills that warriors would need to survive and prevail in actual warfare. The tactical coordination of mounted archer units required sophisticated leadership and communication. The units would coordinate their movements to concentrate fire on particular enemy formations, would maneuver to attack from angles that minimized exposure to enemy archery, and would time their withdrawals to maintain continuous pressure without allowing enemy to close to melee range. The battlefield control that successful mounted archery required meant that effective commanders needed to understand three-dimensional tactical problems, and to make real-time decisions coordinating multiple units. The introduction of massed shigaryu spear formations in the Sengoku period began to neutralize mounted archery's dominance. The dense formations of long spears created barriers that horses wouldn't or couldn't penetrate, while the volume of arrows from massed archery units could overwhelm individual mounted archers' ability to evade. The tactical environment evolved from one where elite mounted archers dominated to one where combined arms coordination became essential. The famous battles where mounted archery featured prominently included many of the conflicts recorded in the Heian and early Kamakura periods. The Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, saw extensive mounted archery combat, with the military chronicles recording individual archery duels and unit actions, where mounted warriors demonstrated their skills. The battle tactics described in sources like the Heike Monogatari, while probably stylized, reflect actual combat methods where mounted archery was primary offensive capability. The challenges of maintaining mounted archery capability during prolonged warfare were substantial. The horses required extensive fodder and care, limiting campaign sustainability. The arrows needed to be manufactured and transported in large quantities. A mounted archer might carry 50 to 100 arrows, but could exhaust that supply in a single engagement, requiring extensive logistics to maintain supplies. The specialized training required meant that effective mounted archers couldn't be quickly produced, making them valuable assets that couldn't easily be replaced if lost. The social prestige associated with mounted archery reinforced its importance beyond pure tactical effectiveness. The ability to ride and shoot demonstrated elite warrior status, separating samurai from foot soldiers who couldn't afford horses or who lacked the training in mounted combat. The ritual importance of archery, used in ceremonies, in temple observances, in New Year's celebrations, reflected and reinforced archery's central place in warrior culture. The transition away from mounted archery dominance occurred gradually through the Sengoku period as firearms, massed infantry formations, and new tactical approaches reduced elite mounted archers' battlefield dominance. Yet even as mounted archery declined in tactical importance, it retained cultural significance as symbol of elite warrior heritage. The modern Kyudo, way of the bow, preserves highly formalized versions of archery technique that retain only distant connections to the combat-focused mounted archery of actual samurai warfare. Understanding mounted archery reveals that for much of samurai history, the bow rather than the sword was the weapon that defined warrior status and that determined battlefield outcomes. The mastery of horseback archery required a lifetime of training beginning in childhood, demanded physical strength and coordination that few could achieve, and created mobile firepower that dominated Japanese battlefields for centuries. The samurai were, fundamentally, mounted archers who also carried swords rather than swordsmen who happened to ride horses and use bows. The distinction is crucial for understanding the historical reality of samurai warfare, and for appreciating the genuine martial skills that made samurai effective warriors, rather than merely figures in romantic narratives about honour and swordsmanship. The ashigaru, foot soldiers who formed the bulk of Japanese armies, have been systematically minimized in romanticized samurai narratives, yet they were the forces whose disciplined formations and whose numbers determined the outcomes of most battles in the Sengoku period. Understanding ashigaru and their role reveals that Japanese warfare was primarily about massed infantry combat, rather than about individual elite warriors engaging in personal duels. The term ashigaru literally means light feet, originally referring to irregular foot soldiers or skirmishers who weren't part of the permanent warrior class. In the earlier medieval period, ashigaru were temporary levies or hired fighters who provided supplementary forces to the samurai who were the primary combat troops. Yet through the Sengoku period, roughly 1467 to 1615, the ashigaru evolved from irregular auxiliaries into disciplined professional soldiers who formed the core strength of all major armies. The social transformation that produced professional ashigaru reflected the military revolution of the Sengoku period. The scale of warfare expanded dramatically, with battles involving tens of thousands of troops rather than the hundreds or few thousands of earlier conflicts. The sustained campaigns and the frequency of warfare created need for standing military forces rather than temporary levies. The tactical innovations emphasizing massed formations required disciplined, trained troops who could maintain cohesion under fire and who could execute complex maneuvers. The ashigaru evolved to fill these needs, becoming semi-professional soldiers who trained regularly and who formed permanent military units. The organization of ashigaru units followed strict hierarchical patterns. The basic unit was typically about 10 men commanded by a kumigashira, group leader, with multiple such units forming larger tactical formations under samurai officers. The emphasis on group cohesion and on maintaining formation discipline reflected tactical reality, that individual prowess mattered less than unit coherence. The training emphasized coordination, maintaining formation while advancing or retreating, and executing specific tactical roles within larger battle plans. The weaponry of ashigaru varied by unit type but was dominated by the yari, spear, and later by firearms. The spear formations were the fundamental ashigaru infantry type, with long spears, often 10 to 12 feet or more, creating walls of weapon points that were nearly impossible for mounted warriors to penetrate. The massed spear formations transformed battlefield dynamics, neutralizing the mobility and individual skill advantages that elite mounted warriors previously enjoyed. The disciplined spearmen could defeat samurai cavalry through maintaining formation, and through the sheer density of weapons presented. The ashigaru yari techniques were simpler and more standardized than the elaborate individual martial arts that developed in peacetime. The training emphasized basic thrusting attacks, maintaining spacing and alignment with neighboring spearmen, and advancing or retreating while keeping formation intact. The collective effect of dozens or hundreds of spearmen maintaining formation was far more militarily effective than individual weapons mastery. The recognition that battle outcomes depended on unit cohesion rather than on individual prowess drove the tactical doctrine that shaped ashigaru training. The introduction of firearms transformed Ashigaru roles dramatically from the mid-16th century. The arquebus, or tanegashima, was ideally suited to Ashigaru soldiers. The weapon required relatively limited training compared to the bow, could penetrate armour at ranges where arrows were less effective, and was most effective when used in massed volleys that required unit coordination rather than individual marksmanship. The samurai who had trained from childhood in archery found their skills devalued by peasant soldiers, with a few weeks of firearms training who could kill them from distance. The tactical formations for arquebus-armed Ashigaru emphasised concentration of firepower through synchronised volleys. The typical deployment involved multiple ranks of gunners, with front ranks firing while rear ranks loaded, creating rotation that maintained continuous fire. The coordination required to execute these tactics depended on discipline and training rather than on individual warrior prowess, further emphasising the importance of unit cohesion and of professional military organisation over elite warrior skills. The armour provided to Ashigaru was much simpler than samurai armour, but was functionally adequate for their roles. The typical Ashigaru armour consisted of simple chest protection, sometimes back protection, basic helmets, and occasionally limb protection, enough to provide some defence against arrows and cuts while being inexpensive enough to equip large forces. Some Ashigaru fought with minimal or no armour, particularly lower-ranking troops or temporary levies. The limited armour reflected both economic constraints and tactical doctrine that emphasised numbers and firepower over individual protection. The logistical challenges of maintaining large Ashigaru forces were substantial. An army of 20,000 troops required enormous quantities of food, with supply calculations for rice, other provisions and fodder for horses creating complex logistical requirements. The armies on campaign needed to carry supplies, to requisition from territory they moved through, or to establish supply lines from their bases. The increasing scale of warfare in the Sengoku period forced development of sophisticated logistical systems that could sustain large forces in field for extended periods. The social status of Ashigaru was ambiguous and evolved through the period. Early in Sengoku period, Ashigaru were clearly separated from samurai by birth and status, yet the most successful Ashigaru could rise through military service to samurai status. The famous example of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who rose from Ashigaru origins to become the most powerful man in Japan, demonstrated the social mobility that military service could provide in this turbulent period. The increasing professionalisation of Ashigaru forces blurred some status distinctions, even as legal frameworks tried to maintain clear separation between warrior and peasant classes. The military effectiveness of disciplined Ashigaru forces is demonstrated by the outcomes of major battles. The Battle of Nagashino, 1575, famously showed firearm-armed Ashigaru defeating elite Takeda cavalry through disciplined volleys protected by field fortifications. The countless smaller engagements and sieges throughout the period consistently showed that well-trained, well-led Ashigaru forces could defeat samurai forces through superior numbers, better coordination, and more effective tactical employment of weapon systems. The military revolution of the Sengoku period was fundamentally about the triumph of massed infantry over elite cavalry. The deliberate historiographical minimizing of Ashigaru contributions in later accounts reflected Tokugawa period concerns about social hierarchy and about preserving samurai status. The chronicles and military tales that celebrated samurai exploits while barely mentioning the foot soldiers who actually did most of the fighting served ideological purposes in society that wanted to emphasize hereditary warrior class superiority. The historical reality was that Ashigaru won the wars even while samurai received the glory and the rewards. Understanding Ashigaru reveals that the romantic image of samurai warfare as being primarily about elite warriors engaging in skilled combat reflects peacetime ideology rather than battlefield reality. The actual warfare of the Sengoku period was dominated by massed formations of professional foot soldiers whose discipline, whose coordination, and whose effective use of spears and firearms determined battle outcomes. The samurai were important as commanders, as elite troops for specific tactical roles, and as the social class that held military and political power. But the fighting and dying that characterized this period of constant warfare was done primarily by Ashigaru, whose contributions have been systematically minimized in the romanticized narratives that have dominated popular understanding of samurai warfare. The sieges of castles and fortified positions were far more common, and far more militarily decisive than the pitched battles that feature prominently in historical narratives and popular culture. Understanding siege warfare reveals that Japanese combat was often about patient investment of fortifications, about logistics and engineering rather than about valour and personal combat, and about forms of warfare where strategic position and supplies mattered more than battlefield prowess. The development of castle fortifications in Japan accelerated through the Sengoku period as warfare intensified and as defensive architecture evolved to counter-offensive tactics. The earlier fortifications were relatively simple structures, often built of earth and wood. Through the 15th and 16th centuries, castle architecture became increasingly sophisticated, with massive stone bases supporting multi-layered towers and walls, with elaborate defensive features including multiple baileys and kill zones, and with positioning on hilltops or other terrain that maximised defensive advantages. The great castles like Himeji, Osaka and Edo represented enormous investments of labour and resources in creating fortifications that could withstand extended siege. The strategic importance of castles extended beyond simply providing defensive positions. The castles controlled transportation routes through mountains or along valleys, dominated fertile agricultural regions that provided tax revenues, served as administrative centres from which lords governed their domains, and functioned as supply depots and bases supporting military operations across wider regions. The control of castles therefore determined control of territories, making castle warfare fundamentally about political and economic power rather than merely about military position. The tactical challenges of assaulting castles were formidable. The massive stone bases couldn't be undermined easily, and provided foundations that couldn't be breached with available weaponry. The height advantages that defenders enjoyed allowed them to shoot down at attackers with arrows and later with firearms, while being relatively protected themselves. The elaborate gates and entrance passages forced attackers into kill zones where concentrated defensive fire could inflict heavy casualties. The multiple defensive layers meant that even if attackers breached outer walls, they faced additional defensive positions that had to be overcome sequentially. The architecture systematically advantaged defenders and made direct assault extremely costly, even when ultimately successful. The primary method of castle siege warfare was investment, surrounding the castle to cut off supplies and communications, then waiting for defenders to exhaust their supplies and surrender. The patience required for successful siege warfare ran counter to romantic notions of glorious combat, yet the strategic results of successful sieges were often more significant than victories in pitched battles. A castle that surrendered after months of siege might cost attackers relatively few casualties, while achieving complete control over the strategic position and the territory it dominated. The logistics of maintaining siege armies created their own challenges. The attacking force needed to be large enough to completely surround the castle, and to prevent relief forces from breaking through, yet the larger the besieging force, the greater the supply requirements. The armies investing castles needed continuous streams of supplies that strained logistics, as much as or more than the defenders' supply needs. The successful siege therefore required not just military force but sophisticated logistical organisation that could sustain large forces for months. The offensive siege tactics that developed included several approaches beyond simple investment. The construction of siege forts around the besieged castle created fortified positions for attackers that protected them from sorties by defenders and from relief forces attempting to break the siege. The siege of Osaka Castle, 1614 to 1615, famously involved massive siege fort construction, with the besiegers essentially building their own fortified cities surrounding Osaka. The scale of these siege works demonstrated the resources that major daimyo could mobilize, and the engineering capabilities that Japanese armies possessed. The attempts to breach castle walls used various methods adapted from available technology. The mining under walls to create collapses was employed, though the massive stone foundations made this difficult. The construction of siege towers that could bring attackers up to wall height allowed assault attempts, though the towers were vulnerable to defensive fire and were difficult to manoeuvre into position. The use of fire was effective against castles with significant wooden construction, with fire arrows or incendiary projectiles potentially starting conflagrations that could force surrender even if walls couldn't be breached by force. The psychological warfare during sieges included attempts to demoralize defenders and to encourage betrayal. The promises of amnesty to defenders who surrendered before the castle fell, contrasted with promises of no mercy if the castle was taken by storm, created incentives for early capitulation. The displays of force by besiegers, the taunting of defenders, and the various intimidation tactics were all designed to weaken defensive resolve. Conversely, defenders would demonstrate their readiness to resist by maintaining visible activity on walls, by responding vigorously to any assault attempts, and by showing that they had adequate supplies to endure extended siege. The role of betrayal in determining siege outcomes was substantial. Many sieges ended when defenders were betrayed by someone who opened gates, or who revealed weak points. The careful attention that castle commanders paid to maintaining loyalty and to preventing infiltration by enemy agents reflected the genuine danger that treachery posed. The stories of dramatic betrayals that ended sieges were common in military chronicles, and reflected real vulnerabilities that besieged castles faced beyond the purely military challenge of holding fortifications against assault. The naval dimensions of some castle sieges added complexity when castles were positioned to control harbours or were otherwise accessible by water. The famous siege of Takamatsu Castle, 1582, involved flooding the castle by damming rivers, creating artificial lake that cut off defenders and that threatened to drown them. This innovative siege technique demonstrated the creative problem-solving that Japanese commanders applied to overcome defensive positions that were impregnable to direct assault. The use of naval forces to blockade coastal castles and to prevent seaborne resupply was crucial in several major sieges. The artillery revolution that firearms brought to siege warfare dramatically changed the tactical balance between attackers and defenders. The cannon that were introduced in the late 16th century could breach even massive stone walls, threatening to make previously impregnable castles vulnerable to direct assault. The relative scarcity and expense of cannon in Japan limited their impact compared to Europe, but the psychological effect of cannon bombardment on defenders and the genuine capability to breach walls that had previously been invulnerable made artillery a significant development in Japanese siege warfare. The transition from active siege to negotiated surrender characterized many major sieges. The defenders would negotiate terms that would allow them to surrender with honor, preserving lives while acknowledging military defeat. The besiegers often preferred negotiated outcomes to costly assaults, accepting terms that allowed defenders to leave with some dignity, rather than forcing them to desperate last stands that would inflict heavy casualties even on the eventual victors. The negotiations reflected sophisticated understanding that warfare was ultimately about achieving political objectives, which could often be accomplished through negotiated surrenders as effectively as through violent assault. The famous long sieges that lasted months or even years demonstrated the extraordinary patience and resources that siege warfare demanded. The siege of Ishiyama Honganji, 1570 to 1580, lasted a decade as the Ikuiki warrior monks resisted Oda Nobunaga's forces through extensive fortifications and through naval resupply routes that took years to effectively blockade the siege of Ganjaku Castle, and various other fortifications similarly demonstrated that well-supplied and determined defenders could resist even vastly superior besieging forces for extended periods when geography and fortifications favoured defence. Understanding siege warfare reveals that the majority of military activity during the Sengoku period involved patient investment of fortified positions rather than the dramatic open-field battles that capture popular imagination. The sieges required strategic patience, sophisticated logistics, engineering skill, and sometimes creative problem-solving rather than the individual martial prowess that peacetime martial ideology celebrated. The commanders who succeeded in Sengoku warfare were those who understood that controlling territory meant controlling castles, that taking castles usually required patience rather than valour, and that successful warfare was ultimately about logistics, supplies, and strategic position as much as or more than about combat prowess. The reality of siege warfare as the dominant form of combat reveals that Japanese warfare in its most militarily significant period was fundamentally different from the romanticized images of samurai combat that later developed during centuries of peace. The naval warfare that was crucial to many conflicts in Japanese history has been largely overlooked in popular narratives about samurai combat, yet the control of sea lanes and the ability to project power across water often determined political outcomes and shaped military strategy throughout Japanese history. Understanding naval combat reveals another dimension of samurai warfare that challenges land-based narratives. The importance of naval power in Japanese warfare reflected geographical reality. Japan is an island nation where inter-island communication and transportation necessarily involved ships. The inland sea between the main islands was a major transportation corridor, where control of sea routes meant control of commerce and military logistics. The coastal regions where much of Japan's population and wealth concentrated could be accessed and threatened by naval forces. The strategic importance of naval capability was therefore substantial, even though Japanese naval warfare never developed the scales or technologies of European naval powers. The types of vessels used in Japanese naval warfare range from small coastal boats to larger warships capable of open water operations. The Atakebune were the largest warships, capable of carrying substantial numbers of troops and equipped with multiple decks, allowing archers and later arquebusiers to fire from elevated positions. The smaller Sekibune served various military purposes, including transporting troops, conducting raids, and serving as escorts. The diversity of vessel types reflected different tactical roles and different economic capabilities of the forces deploying them. The naval combat tactics emphasized boarding and melee combat rather than standoff engagements with ship-mounted weapons. The typical naval battle involved maneuvering to bring vessels alongside enemy ships, then fighting aboard the vessels with essentially the same weapons used in land combat: bows, spears, and swords. The naval warriors were essentially land warriors who happened to be fighting on ships rather than being specialized naval combatants. The grappling hooks and boarding bridges that facilitated moving between vessels were important tactical equipment that allowed the melee combat that determined most naval battles. The archery from ships created longer-range combat capability than existed in European naval warfare before the age of cannon. The powerful Japanese bows could engage enemy vessels at substantial ranges, with arrows capable of killing or wounding enemy combatants on opposing ships. The fire arrows that could ignite enemy vessels added additional dimension to archery's utility in naval combat. The arquebus later provided even more effective fire from ships, with the firearms being devastatingly effective in the confined spaces of ship decks. The famous naval battles included several engagements that had significant historical impact. The Battle of Dan no Yura, 1185, was the climactic naval engagement of the Genpei War, where the Minamoto clan's forces defeated the Taira fleet, leading to the Taira's annihilation and establishing Minamoto supremacy. The various naval conflicts during the attempts to invade Korea in the 1590s saw Japanese forces engaging Korean naval forces, including the famous turtle ships, with mixed results that demonstrated both capabilities and limitations of Japanese naval power. The conflicts involving Waco, Japanese pirates to traders, showed the ability of naval forces to project power across substantial distances. The strategic uses of naval power included more than just ship-to-ship combat. The ability to transport troops rapidly by sea allowed commanders to concentrate forces quickly at threatened points, or to conduct amphibious operations that bypassed land-based defences. The supply of besieged castles by sea, when land routes were blocked, was crucial in several extended sieges. The raiding of coastal targets by naval forces could devastate enemy economic capacity, while being difficult to prevent or counter. The control of straits and channels allowed interdiction of enemy maritime communications and commerce. The castle building that extended to maritime fortifications reflected the integration of land and naval warfare. Various castles were positioned to control harbours, or were equipped with facilities for naval forces. The fortifications at strategic coastal locations combined traditional castle defensive features with capability to support and protect naval vessels. The integration of land and maritime fortifications demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare that encompassed both land and naval dimensions. The Murakami Navy and other regional naval powers maintained substantial maritime forces that controlled specific sea areas and that played crucial roles in various conflicts. These essentially professional naval forces developed specialized expertise in maritime warfare, in ship handling, and in the tactics specific to naval combat. The existence of these specialized forces demonstrates that naval warfare was sufficiently important and sufficiently distinct from land warfare to support professional naval warriors whose skills and roles differed from conventional land-based samurai. The Korean turtle ships that defeated Japanese naval forces during the invasions of Korea demonstrated technological innovations that affected naval combat. The armoured roofs that protected Korean rowers and warriors from Japanese archery, the cannon mounted in the ships, and the ramming tactics that Korean commanders employed all represented naval warfare innovations that the Japanese forces had to adapt to. The Korean naval victories under Admiral Yi Sun-sin showed that Japanese naval power had limits, and that technological and tactical innovation could overcome even substantial numerical advantages. The piracy and maritime raiding that characterized much of Japanese naval activity blurred lines between legitimate warfare and simple piracy. The Waco who raided coastal regions of China and Korea operated with varying degrees of official sanction from Japanese authorities. The maritime adventurers who conducted trade and conducted raids often simultaneously, the complex relationships between merchants and warriors in maritime contexts, and the practical difficulties of distinguishing legitimate military operations from piracy all complicated the maritime dimension of Japanese warfare. The decline of indigenous naval power during the Tokugawa period reflected the Tokugawa policy of limiting foreign contact and of restricting shipbuilding to prevent potential challenges to their authority, the prohibitions on building large ships capable of ocean-going voyages, the restrictions on foreign trade, and the general pacification of Japan eliminated most need for naval warfare during the Long Peace. The naval traditions that had been militarily significant in earlier periods atrophied, with the result that Japan was unprepared for naval challenges when Western powers arrived in the 19th century. Understanding naval combat reveals that Japanese warfare encompassed maritime dimensions that were strategically important, even though they've been underemphasized in popular narratives. The samurai who fought at sea used adapted versions of land combat techniques, demonstrating versatility rather than narrow specialization. The naval forces that controlled sea lanes, that supported land operations through seaborne logistics, and that projected power across maritime distances were crucial to political and military outcomes throughout Japanese history. The recognition that water was as important as land in Japanese strategic thinking provides more complete understanding of warfare in island nation, where maritime and terrestrial dimensions were inseparably linked in actual military operations, even though land warfare has dominated historical narratives and popular imagination. The training that produced effective samurai warriors combined early childhood introduction to martial skills with lifelong practice and with educational systems that emphasize multiple forms of knowledge beyond simple weapons handling understanding training methods, reveals both the sophistication of martial education and the ways that training evolved from purely practical combat preparation to more philosophical and aesthetic pursuits during peacetime. The childhood training for samurai sons began remarkably early, often around age 5 or 6. The initial instruction emphasized building physical strength and coordination through exercises and games that developed balance, flexibility, and body awareness. The gradual introduction to weapons began with appropriately sized practice weapons, small bows, lightweight swords, practice spears that allowed children to develop proper form without injury. The training explicitly recognized that effective warriors needed to develop from childhood, rather than attempting to teach adult beginners the complex skills that warfare required. The archery training formed the core of martial education for most of samurai history. The students would begin learning proper stance, how to hold the bow, how to draw using correct form that distributed force appropriately across the body. The progression from stationary targets at close range to moving targets at distance occurred gradually over years of practice. The mounted archery training added additional complexity, requiring mastery of horsemanship before attempting to shoot from horseback, then slowly integrating the two skills through progressive exercises. The complete training cycle from beginning instruction to mastery required decades of continuous practice. The swordsmanship training followed similar progressive patterns. The beginners learned basic cuts using wooden practice swords, bokken, developing proper form through endless repetition. The practice emphasized correct body mechanics, generating power through hip rotation, maintaining balance through footwork, cutting on proper angles that would be effective against armor. The training partners would practice set patterns, kata, that taught proper responses to various attacks, and that developed muscle memory for techniques that would need to be executed instantly in combat, without conscious thought. The spear and polearm training was particularly emphasized once massed infantry formations became dominant. The training for Yari techniques focused on thrusting attacks, on maintaining proper spacing with other soldiers in formation, and on coordination with unit members. The training was more standardized and less individualized than sword or archery training, reflecting tactical reality that spear combat was primarily about unit cohesion rather than individual technique. The drills emphasized maintaining formation while advancing or retreating, creating the coordination that made spear units effective. The intellectual education that complemented physical training included literacy, classical Chinese learning, military strategy, and various cultural accomplishments. The reading of military classics like Sun Tzu's Art of War and various Japanese military treatises provided theoretical frameworks for understanding warfare beyond simple technical skills. The study of Chinese philosophy, history, and literature provided cultural sophistication that distinguished educated warriors from simple fighters. The training in calligraphy, poetry, and tea ceremony reflected the ideal that warriors should be cultured individuals rather than merely effective killers. The practical military education included learning about logistics, about supply management, about siege warfare techniques, about naval operations, and about various other aspects of actual warfare beyond individual combat. The training in how to maintain equipment, how to manage horses, how to organize camps, and how to coordinate military operations provided practical knowledge that commanders needed. The comprehensive nature of proper military education meant that effective samurai leaders needed to master numerous practical skills beyond weapons handling. The role of schools, ryu, in systematizing and transmitting martial knowledge became increasingly important. The various martial arts schools developed distinctive techniques, teaching methods, and philosophical approaches that were transmitted from masters to students through formal apprenticeship relationships. The schools preserved specific technical knowledge, while also creating lineages and traditions that gave practitioners identity beyond simple skill. The proliferation of schools during the Tokugawa period reflected transformation of martial arts from purely combat-focused to more philosophical and aesthetic pursuits. The kata or formal patterns of movement became increasingly central to martial arts training, particularly during peacetime when actual combat experience wasn't available. The kata preserved idealized versions of combat techniques, allowing practitioners to train proper form without partners and to maintain skills in absence of actual fighting. Yet the transformation of kata into primary training method, rather than supplement to actual combat experience, created increasing divergence between martial arts, as practiced, and actual combat effectiveness, with techniques becoming increasingly stylized and divorced from practical application. The armor training ensured that warriors could fight effectively while wearing heavy protective equipment. The practice in moving, fighting, mounting horses, and performing all combat techniques while fully armoured was essential, as armour significantly affected mobility and technique execution. The neglect of armour training during peacetime contributed to declining practical combat effectiveness, as techniques developed and practiced without armour often didn't transfer effectively to armoured combat. The testing of skills occurred in various contexts. During wartime, actual combat provided ultimate test of effectiveness. During peacetime, the controlled sparring between practitioners, the competitive events testing specific skills like archery accuracy or cutting ability, and the demonstrations where martial artists displayed techniques all provided context for evaluation. The transition from combat effectiveness as measure of skill to aesthetic quality and philosophical sophistication reflected broader transformation of martial arts during peace. The physical conditioning that supported martial skills required continuous attention. The strength training, the endurance development, and the maintenance of flexibility all required regular exercise throughout warriors' careers. The training methods included specific exercises for developing shooting power, for building leg strength needed for proper sword cuts, and for general conditioning. The integration of physical conditioning with technique practice created comprehensive training regimens that maintained warriors' capabilities. The psychological preparation for combat was also part of training, though less formally structured than physical instruction. The Zen Buddhism that became closely associated with warrior culture provided mental disciplines for managing fear, for maintaining focus under stress, and for accepting death as an inevitable aspect of warrior existence. The meditation practices, the mental training in emotional control, and the philosophical frameworks for understanding violence and death all contributed to psychological preparation for warfare's realities. Understanding training methods reveals that effective samurai warriors were products of comprehensive, lifelong educational systems that developed physical skills, intellectual capabilities, and psychological preparation for warfare. The training combined practical combat instruction with cultural education and with philosophical frameworks that elevated warriors above mere fighters. Yet the transformation of martial training during the long Tokugawa peace, from combat preparation to aesthetic and philosophical pursuit, represented fundamental shift in purposes and emphasis, creating divergence between historical warrior training that produced effective fighters and the martial arts traditions that developed during peace, and that emphasized very different qualities and goals than actual combat effectiveness would require. The recognition that samurai training evolved from purely practical combat preparation to more cultural and philosophical pursuits reveals how peace transformed warrior culture while claiming to preserve it. The armour worn by samurai fundamentally shaped how combat occurred, determining which techniques were practical and which weapons were effective. Understanding armour reveals that the combat techniques that are effective against unarmoured or lightly armoured opponents differ dramatically from those useful against fully armoured warriors, and that much of what modern martial arts practice involves wouldn't work against historical armour. The construction of samurai armour evolved through Japanese history, with earlier armour forms being quite different from the iconic armour most familiar from later periods. The early armour was primarily lamellar construction, small iron or leather plates laced together with silk or leather cords. The construction created flexible protection that allowed good mobility while providing substantial defence against cuts. The armour was expensive to construct and maintain, with the fine craftsmanship and the quality of materials reflecting the wearer's wealth and status. The Domaru and Oyoroi armour styles reflected different tactical roles and time periods. The Oyoroi was the classic mounted warrior armour, designed for horseback archery with particular attention to protecting the left side that would face enemy when shooting. The Domaru evolved as armour for foot combat became more important, providing more uniform protection around the body while maintaining flexibility. The evolution of armour styles tracked changes in warfare, with armour adapting to new weapons and new tactical roles. The component parts of full armour included the do, chest armour, the kabuto, helmet, the kote, armoured sleeves, the heidate, thigh protection, the sunite, shin guards, and the various other pieces that provided comprehensive coverage. The complexity of full armour meant that properly equipping a warrior required assistance, with specialised knowledge needed to correctly fit and secure all components. The time required to fully armour oneself meant that warriors couldn't quickly arm during surprise attacks, creating vulnerabilities when caught unprepared. The protection that armour provided was substantial against period weapons. The arrows that could penetrate unarmoured targets were much less effective against the multiple layers of lacquered plates that characterised good armour. The cuts from swords generally couldn't penetrate armour, with the curved blades potentially catching in the laced cords, but rarely cutting through to injure the wearer. The spear thrusts similarly had difficulty penetrating armour except at specific gaps, the face opening in helmets, under the arms, behind the knees, and other locations where armour pieces joined and where some flexibility was necessary. The combat techniques that armour necessitated emphasised targeting these weak points, rather than attempting to cut or thrust through armour itself. The grappling to immobilise opponents, followed by using tanto, daggers, to stab into armour gaps, was essential technique for defeating armoured opponents in close combat. The attempts to knock opponents down where they couldn't easily rise due to armour weight created opportunities to finish them while they were helpless. The recognition that armour made warriors largely invulnerable to casual strikes meant that proper technique required specific knowledge of armour construction and vulnerabilities. The weight and mobility restrictions of armour affected combat in complex ways. The full armour weighed 40 to 60 pounds depending on quality and completeness, creating substantial burden that affected stamina and mobility. Yet the weight distribution was relatively good, with loads spread across the body rather than concentrated in particular areas. The flexibility of lamellar construction meant that mobility was better than solid plate armour would provide, allowing warriors to move, fight, and even perform acrobatic movements while armoured, though certainly with more difficulty than without armour. The heat and exhaustion that fighting in armour produced was substantial, particularly in summer campaigns. The multiple layers, the restricted ventilation, and the physical exertion of combat while carrying armour weight meant that warriors could become exhausted relatively quickly. The breaks in combat, the importance of pacing oneself, and the practical limits on how long intensive fighting could continue, all reflected physical realities that armour imposed on warfare. The romantic images of lengthy sword duels ignore these practical limitations. The maintenance of armour required constant attention and specialised knowledge. The lacing needed periodic replacement as cords aged and frayed. The metal plates needed cleaning and occasional replacement if damaged. The lacquer finishing needed renewal to maintain weather protection. The proper storage to prevent rust and deterioration required care. The investment in quality armour was ongoing rather than one-time expense, with maintenance costs being substantial across armour's lifetime. The decoration and personalisation of armour reflected warrior identity and status. The ornate helmets with distinctive crests, the specific colour schemes and patterns in lacing, the family crests applied to various armour components. All these created visual identity that allowed warriors to be recognised on battlefields, and that demonstrated wealth and status through quality and elaborateness. The armour was simultaneously functional protection and status display, with these dual purposes creating pressure to balance practical effectiveness with visual impact. The evolution towards simpler armour in later Sengoku period reflected changing tactical realities. The mass production of armour for larger Shigeru forces created pressure for simpler, cheaper designs. The increasing effectiveness of firearms against traditional armour questioned whether expensive, elaborate armour was worth the cost when bullets could penetrate it. The development of simple munitions-grade armour that provided basic protection at lower cost showed pragmatic adaptation to new military realities, where equipping large forces took precedence over optimal individual protection. The combat without armour created completely different tactical environment that affected technique selection. The unarmoured opponents that might be encountered in civilian contexts, in surprise attacks, or in various other scenarios could be defeated with techniques that would be ineffective against armoured warriors. The cutting attacks that were largely useless against armour became effective killing techniques against unarmoured targets. The transformation of martial arts during the peaceful Tokugawa period partly involved adaptation to scenarios where armour wouldn't be worn, creating techniques optimised for different threat environments than battlefield combat involved. The decline of armour wearing during Tokugawa period reflected both the decreasing military need and the impracticality of armour for administrative and ceremonial roles. The samurai who became bureaucrats and administrators had no need for heavy protective equipment. The armour became primarily ceremonial object, maintained for formal occasions but not worn for actual protection. The martial arts that developed during this period increasingly assumed unarmoured contexts, creating divergence between historical combat techniques designed for use with armour and later techniques assuming its absence. Understanding armour reveals that historical samurai combat occurred in tactical environment completely different from what modern practice typically assumes. The techniques effective against unarmoured opponents often didn't work against properly armoured warriors, while the techniques necessary for defeating armoured opponents required specific knowledge of armour construction and vulnerabilities. The combat was about patient attempts to create openings where armour gaps could be exploited, about using heavy weapons to inflict impact injuries through armour, or about using specialised anti-armour techniques, rather than about the flowing sword techniques that look elegant in demonstrations, but that would be ineffective against historical protection. The recognition that armour fundamentally constrained combat techniques, and that much modern martial arts practice occurs in context divorced from armour, realities reveals another dimension of divergence between historical combat and later peacetime martial traditions. The psychological and ritual elements of samurai warfare were genuine aspects of how conflicts were conducted, serving practical purposes in intimidating enemies, in establishing social hierarchy, and in managing violence through cultural frameworks. Understanding these elements reveals that warfare was never purely about physical combat, but always involved cultural performances that shaped how violence occurred and how it was understood. The pre-battle rituals that preceded many engagements served multiple purposes beyond simple ceremony. The formal exchanges between armies, announcing names, reciting genealogies, issuing challenges, created frameworks for combat while serving practical functions. The declarations allowed warriors to identify important enemy commanders who would be valuable to kill or capture. The ritual challenges established hierarchies and determined who would fight whom, channeling violence into patterns that served social purposes beyond simple slaughter. The ceremonies created time for armies to deploy properly and for commanders to assess situations before committing to combat. The famous story of the Battle of Yoshima, where Nasuno Yoichi shot a fan from a pole on a boat, illustrates the ritual challenges that characterize some combat. The Taira forces dared Minamoto archers to hit the difficult target, creating dramatic moment that tested skill while entertaining both sides. The successful shot both demonstrated martial prowess and affected morale, showing how ritual elements integrated with practical military purposes. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as described is less important than what it reveals about cultural expectations that warfare should include such dramatic demonstrations. The intimidation tactics that armies employed included visual displays designed to appear overwhelming. The elaborate armour and helmet decorations made individual warriors look larger and more imposing. The banners and standards that units carried created visual mass that made forces appear more numerous. The war cries, kiai, and battle shouts that warriors employed created acoustic intimidation, while also coordinating attacks. The deployment of forces in impressive formations demonstrated military capacity, while potentially intimidating opponents into avoiding combat entirely. The psychological impact of these displays could determine outcomes without fighting, achieving military objectives through intimidation rather than violence. The taking of heads as proof of victories served both practical and psychological purposes. The heads provided verifiable evidence of combat achievements that could be rewarded appropriately, creating an incentive system that motivated warriors. Yet the display of taken heads also served to intimidate enemies and to celebrate victories in ways that the culture understood. The head viewing ceremonies, where commanders would examine heads taken by their warriors, formalized recognition while reinforcing hierarchy. The practice seems brutal to modern sensibilities, but reflected cultural patterns where such displays were normal aspects of military culture. The ritual suicide, seppuku, that defeated commanders might perform served to preserve honour in defeat while also serving practical purposes. The suicide allowed defeated leaders to die by their own hands rather than being captured and potentially tortured or publicly humiliated. The elaborate protocols surrounding seppuku created a framework where even suicide became cultural performance, following specific patterns. The recognition that defeated warriors would kill themselves rather than surrender affected tactics, as enemies known to fight to death required different approaches than those who might surrender when defeated. The use of psychological operations including deception, misinformation, and attempts to sow discord among enemy ranks was sophisticated and common. The spreading of rumours about overwhelming force, about inevitable victory, or about lack of supplies designed to demoralise enemies without fighting. The attempts to bribe or suborn enemy commanders to betray their lords could accomplish through treachery what force couldn't achieve. The recognition that warfare was partly about breaking enemy will, rather than simply about destroying enemy forces, shaped strategic thinking and tactical choices. The famous quote attributed to Sun Tzu that supreme excellence lies in breaking enemy resistance without fighting resonated in Japanese strategic thinking. The commanders who could achieve objectives through maneuver, through intimidation, through negotiation, or through various other means without actually fighting achieved superior outcomes to those who won costly battles. The cultural recognition that avoiding battle while accomplishing objectives was preferable to victory through violence shaped how warfare was conducted and how military success was evaluated. The role of omens, portents, and supernatural beliefs affected military decision-making and morale. The consultation of divination before campaigns, the interpretation of dreams or unusual occurrences as signs about battle outcomes, and the various superstitious practices that warriors engaged in all reflected genuine beliefs that supernatural forces influenced military outcomes. The manipulation of these beliefs, creating false omens, interpreting events to support desired conclusions, using religious or supernatural rhetoric to motivate troops, was part of psychological operations that sophisticated commanders employed. The honour concepts that are often emphasised in samurai narratives had complex relationships to actual combat behaviour. While codes about appropriate conduct existed and influenced behaviour, the practical reality was that warriors did whatever was necessary to win, with honour being preserved through after-the-fact narratives that explained pragmatic decisions in terms that met cultural expectations. The flexibility of honour concepts allowed warriors to justify virtually any action as being honourable within appropriate frameworks, making honour less a rigid constraint on behaviour than a cultural vocabulary for discussing and legitimising actions. The treatment of enemies varied dramatically based on tactical circumstances and political considerations. Enemies who surrendered might be treated mercifully, or might be executed, depending on whether keeping them alive served purposes. The civilians in war zones might be protected, might be ignored, or might be deliberately targeted depending on strategic situations. The variability of treatment reflects that warfare followed pragmatic calculations more than absolute rules, with cultural concepts being flexible enough to accommodate widely varying practices. The religious dimensions of warfare included invocations of Buddhist and Shinto deities, dedication of victories to particular temples or shrines, and religious ceremonies before and after campaigns. The warrior monks, Sohei, who actively participated in warfare as armed fighters, represented direct integration of religious and military functions. The religious justifications for warfare and the ritual frameworks that surrounded military activities reflected deep integration of religious and military cultures in Japanese history. The poetry and artistic production related to warfare provided outlets for expressing experiences and emotions while creating cultural frameworks for understanding combat. The warriors who composed poems before death, the artistic representations of famous battles, the military tales that combined historical events with literary embellishment. All these cultural productions shaped how warfare was understood and remembered. The artistic dimensions elevated warfare beyond mere violence into cultural significance that gave meaning to experiences that might otherwise be simply traumatic. Understanding psychological and ritual warfare reveals that Japanese combat always involved cultural performances and mental dimensions alongside physical violence. The intimidation tactics, the ritual challenges, the honour frameworks, the supernatural beliefs, all these shaped how violence occurred while serving practical military purposes. The warfare was never purely about physical combat, but always involved psychological manipulation, cultural performance, and social hierarchy enforcement that integrated violence into broader cultural systems. The recognition that warfare was as much about breaking enemy will and establishing social order as about physical destruction provides more sophisticated understanding of how samurai warfare actually functioned and how military outcomes were achieved through complex combinations of physical force, psychological pressure, and cultural performance. The introduction of firearms to Japan in 1543 and their rapid adoption transformed Japanese warfare more profoundly than any other single development, rendering many traditional elite warrior skills obsolete while empowering massed infantry formations and fundamentally changing tactical and strategic calculations. Understanding the firearm revolution reveals how quickly and completely military technology can transform warfare and how adaptable Japanese military leaders were in recognizing and exploiting new capabilities. The arrival of firearms came through Portuguese traders who landed on Tanegashima Island, giving the arquebus its Japanese name Tanegashima. The Japanese immediately recognized the military potential and began reverse engineering the weapons, rapidly developing indigenous production capability. Within a few decades, Japanese gun manufacturing reached scales that rivaled European production, with estimates suggesting Japan possessed more firearms than any European nation by the end of the 16th century. The speed of technological adoption demonstrates both Japanese metallurgical capabilities and the pragmatic willingness to embrace foreign innovations that provided military advantages. The tactical advantages that firearms provided were substantial. The arquebus could penetrate armour at ranges where bows were less effective, making individual warriors vulnerable in ways that traditional weapons couldn't achieve. The firearms required relatively limited training compared to the lifelong practice needed for effective archery, allowing armies to quickly create effective firearms units from recruits with minimal martial training. The psychological impact of firearm reports, the noise, the smoke, the mysterious killing at distance, created fear that affected morale beyond simple casualty rates. The combination of effectiveness, ease of training, and psychological impact made firearms extraordinarily valuable military assets. The technical limitations of early firearms were also significant. The matchlock mechanisms required keeping the match, slow-burning cord, lit and dry, creating problems in wet weather. The loading process was relatively slow, requiring roughly 30 seconds to a minute between shots for trained soldiers. The accuracy was limited, with individual aim shots being unreliable beyond fairly close range. The reliability was imperfect, with misfires being common. Yet despite these limitations, the tactical employment that Japanese commanders developed maximised firearms' effectiveness while mitigating their weaknesses. The tactical formations for firearms units emphasised massed volley fire rather than individual marksmanship. The typical deployment involved multiple ranks of gunners, with front ranks firing synchronised volleys, then moving to the rear to reload while other ranks fired. The rotation system maintained continuous fire, creating volume of shots that compensated for individual inaccuracy. The concentration of fire on specific target areas, enemy formations, specific units, particular locations, created killing zones that enemies couldn't easily traverse. The tactics required discipline and coordination more than individual skill, advantaging professional military units over warriors relying on personal prowess. The integration of firearms with traditional weapons in combined arms formations represented sophisticated tactical thinking. The firearms provided ranged firepower, while spear units provided defence against enemy cavalry and close combat capability. The remaining mounted archers and samurai cavalry provided mobility and ability to exploit opportunities that firearms and spear units created. The coordination of different unit types into comprehensive tactical systems represented military thought of high sophistication that recognised that warfare was about combined effects of different arms rather than about dominance of single weapon type. The Battle of Nagashino, 1575, famously demonstrated firearms' tactical potential when Oda Nobunaga's forces defeated the renowned Takeda cavalry. The deployment of firearms units behind field fortifications, the volley fire system that maintained continuous shooting, and the integration of firearms with spear units that protected gunners from cavalry charges created comprehensive tactical system that the Takeda cavalry couldn't overcome despite their reputation for invincibility. The battle's outcome influenced military thinking across Japan, accelerating firearms adoption and spurring tactical innovations that integrated guns into overall force structures. The castle warfare implications of firearms were profound. The ability of arquebusiers to shoot down at attackers from castle walls created additional defensive advantage for already formidable fortifications. The defensive fire could inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces attempting to scale walls or to breach gates. Yet the introduction of cannon in later periods threatened castle walls that had previously been invulnerable to available siege weapons. The arms race between offensive and defensive capabilities drove both improvements in fortifications and in siege weapons through the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The social implications of firearms were potentially revolutionary. The devaluation of traditional elite warrior skills when peasant gunners with limited training could kill samurai who had trained from childhood threatened established social hierarchies. The recognition that military effectiveness no longer required hereditary warrior status potentially undermined the entire samurai class justification. Yet rather than causing social revolution, the firearms were integrated into military systems that maintained samurai dominance through their roles as commanders and through their continued importance in combined arms forces. The potential social disruption was managed through adaptation rather than through resistance to technological change. The regulation and control of firearms became important political concern. The later Tokugawa government, after pacifying Japan, implemented strict controls on firearms possession and on manufacturing, ostensibly for security, but effectively preventing potential challenges to their authority. The Christian rebellions, including the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, where rebels effectively used firearms against government forces, demonstrated that widespread firearm availability could threaten government stability. The subsequent strict gun control helped ensure that Tokugawa authority wouldn't face armed resistance that effective firearms use might enable. The decline of firearms emphasis during the long Tokugawa peace reflected both reduced military need and deliberate policy choices. The samurai who became administrators had little use for practical firearm skills, while the symbolic importance of traditional weapons like swords increased during peace as markers of status. The firearms knowledge that Japanese forces possessed declined during 2 centuries of peace, contributing to the shock when Western powers arrived in the 19th century with vastly superior firearms technology that Japanese forces couldn't match. The comparison with European firearms development reveals both parallels and divergences. Both Japan and Europe rapidly adopted firearms and developed tactics optimizing their use. Yet European armies continued advancing firearms technology, while Japanese development essentially stopped after 1600. The different trajectories reflected Japan's relative isolation during Tokugawa period versus European competitive pressures that drove continuous military innovation. The result was that by the 19th century, Japanese firearms were hopelessly obsolete compared to Western weapons, contributing to the military crises that forced Japanese modernization. Understanding firearms revolution reveals that samurai warfare was never static, but continuously evolved in response to technological and tactical innovations. The rapid adoption of firearms, the sophisticated tactical integration into combined arms systems, and the pragmatic willingness to embrace foreign technology that provided military advantages all demonstrate that successful samurai commanders were adaptive professionals rather than tradition-bound reactionaries. The firearms transformed warfare as completely as any technological development in military history, rendering certain traditional skills obsolete, while creating new requirements for different capabilities. The revolution demonstrates that military effectiveness requires continuous adaptation to technological change, and that those who successfully integrate new capabilities while maintaining what remains valuable from tradition gain decisive advantages over those who resist change in service of preserving traditional ways that new technologies have rendered obsolete. As this comprehensive exploration of how samurai actually fought concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition of the vast gulf between the romanticized image of samurai warfare that developed during centuries of peace and the pragmatic, brutal, technologically adaptive reality of actual combat during Japan's periods of intensive warfare. The samurai were neither the honour-bound aesthetes of later ideology nor simple thugs, but rather professional warriors who adapted continuously to changing tactical and technological realities, while operating within cultural frameworks that shaped but never completely determined their behaviour. The primacy of the bow over the sword throughout most of samurai history fundamentally contradicts the katana-centered image that dominates popular culture. The historical samurai were mounted archers whose primary combat function was shooting arrows from horseback, with swordsmanship being a secondary skill for situations where primary weapons were unavailable or inappropriate. The enormous effort invested in archery training from childhood reflected the bow's tactical importance and the genuine skill required for effective combat archery. The romantic elevation of the sword during the peaceful Tokugawa period reflected changing social functions and cultural values rather than battlefield reality, creating mythology that has profoundly shaped modern understanding while obscuring historical truth. The crucial role of Ashigaru infantry, whose disciplined formations and whose effective use of spears and firearms determined most battle outcomes during the Sengoku period, has been systematically minimized in narratives that emphasize elite warriors. Yet the military revolution of this period was fundamentally about the triumph of massed, trained infantry over elite cavalry, about the effectiveness of coordinated units over individual prowess, and about the importance of firearms that equalized combat and that devalued the skills that samurai had spent lifetimes developing. The Ashigaru won the wars even though samurai received the glory, creating historical record that systematically distorts the actual dynamics of period warfare. The dominance of siege warfare as the most common form of serious combat challenges, narratives focused on open field battles and individual combat, the patient investment of fortified positions, the complex logistics of maintaining siege armies, and the engineering challenges of overcoming sophisticated fortifications represented the routine military activities that determined territorial control and political outcomes. The sieges required different virtues than romantic narratives celebrate: patience rather than valour, logistical sophistication rather than martial prowess, strategic position rather than combat skill. The recognition that most militarily significant activities involved unglamorous blockades and negotiations rather than glorious combat reveals how thoroughly romantic mythology has obscured military reality. The versatility of samurai warfare encompassing naval operations, combined arms tactics integrating multiple weapon types, psychological operations, and rapid adoption of new technologies demonstrates sophisticated military thought and practical adaptability. The commanders who succeeded in Sengoku warfare understood warfare comprehensively rather than narrowly, recognized that military success required integrated systems rather than single capabilities, and adapted pragmatically to technological and tactical developments rather than clinging to tradition. The sophisticated understanding of warfare that historical sources reveal, when read carefully, contradicts simplistic images of tradition-bound warriors resisting change. The transformation of martial culture during the peaceful Tokugawa period created the romantic mythology that now shapes popular understanding. The samurai who became administrators developed elaborate philosophical and aesthetic frameworks that elevated peacetime martial arts into cultural practices, emphasizing spiritual development and artistic refinement over combat effectiveness. The Bushido ideology that developed during this period projected backward onto earlier periods, concepts and values that would have been foreign or impractical to actual warriors fighting for survival and victory. The peaceful martial arts that emphasized honor, aesthetic technique, and philosophical depth created traditions that were genuinely valuable cultural developments while being profoundly different from the pragmatic combat methods of earlier periods. The recognition that armor fundamentally constrained combat techniques, and that much modern martial arts practice occurs without consideration of armor, creates another dimension of divergence between historical reality and later traditions. The techniques effective against unarmoured opponents often wouldn't work against properly armoured warriors, while the specific anti-armour techniques necessary for battlefield effectiveness aren't prominent in peacetime martial arts that developed in contexts where armour wasn't worn. The armourless practice environment created technical traditions that are genuinely skilled and sophisticated, while being poorly adapted to historical combat realities. The integration of cultural performances and psychological warfare with physical combat reveals that warfare was never purely about violence, but always involved social meaning and cultural frameworks. The ritual challenges, the intimidation displays, the honour concepts that legitimize certain behaviours while constraining others, all these shaped how combat occurred while serving purposes beyond simple destruction. Yet the flexibility of these cultural frameworks meant they could accommodate widely varying behaviours, with honour concepts being malleable enough to justify pragmatic decisions while maintaining cultural coherence. The warfare was simultaneously cultural performance and deadly pragmatic violence, with neither dimension fully explaining historical reality without the other. The firearm revolution demonstrates both the speed with which military technology can transform warfare and the adaptability of Japanese commanders in recognizing and exploiting new capabilities. The rapid adoption of firearms, the sophisticated tactical integration into combined arms systems, and the massive production scales achieved within decades of introduction all show that Japanese military culture valued effectiveness over tradition when the two conflicted. The devaluation of traditional elite skills that firearms caused potentially threatened social hierarchies, yet the adaptation maintained samurai dominance through their roles as commanders even as their traditional martial skills became less militarily relevant. The systematic historiographical distortion that minimized Ashigaru contributions, that elevated swords over bows, that emphasized individual combat over formation warfare, and that projected peacetime values backward onto wartime periods created mythology, serving Tokugawa period social and political purposes. The understanding that much of what we think we know about samurai reflects deliberately constructed tradition rather than historical reality should inspire both scholarly caution and appreciation for how powerfully ideology shapes historical narratives. The careful reading of sources against their biases, the attention to material evidence and tactical logic, and the comparative analysis with other military traditions all help reveal realities that official narratives obscured. The human experiences of warriors who lived through Sengoku warfare, the fear and exhaustion, the suffering of wounds and diseases, the moral compromises that survival required, the genuine bonds between warriors who fought together, the grief of losing comrades, the trauma of killing, all these remain partially recoverable through careful attention to the sources that preserve glimpses of authentic experience beneath the stylized narratives. The recognition that historical warriors were complex humans, rather than simple embodiments of cultural ideals, provides more honest and more humanly meaningful engagement with the past. The lessons about military effectiveness that samurai warfare teaches remain relevant despite completely different technological contexts. The importance of combined arms coordination, the value of disciplined units over individually skilled but uncoordinated fighters, the recognition that warfare is ultimately about breaking enemy will as much as destroying enemy forces, the necessity of continuous adaptation to technological change, the understanding that military success requires comprehensive capabilities rather than narrow specialization. All these insights translate across radically different eras and technologies, representing strategic wisdom that persists even as specific tactical and technological contexts transform completely. As light returns and this extensive journey through samurai combat concludes, what remains is profound appreciation for the complexity, the adaptability, and the genuine martial sophistication of historical samurai warriors, alongside recognition that the romantic mythology that developed during peacetime, while culturally valuable and aesthetically powerful, profoundly distorts the historical reality of how samurai actually fought. The warriors who succeeded on Sengoku battlefields were pragmatic professionals who used whatever weapons and methods were effective, who adapted quickly to technological and tactical innovations, who understood warfare comprehensively rather than narrowly, and who operated within cultural frameworks that shaped but never completely determined their behaviour. The real samurai were simultaneously more complex and more brutal, more sophisticated and more pragmatic, more adaptive and more culturally embedded than simplified romantic images suggest. They were masters of the bow rather than the sword for most of their history, commanders of massed infantry rather than solo warriors, participants in months-long sieges rather than brief dramatic battles, and pragmatic adopters of firearms rather than tradition-bound reactionaries. The gap between historical reality and romantic mythology reveals how powerfully cultural needs for heroic narratives can reshape historical understanding, creating traditions that serve present purposes while obscuring past realities. The recognition that samurai warfare evolved continuously, that it encompassed far more than sword combat, that it was determined primarily by factors other than individual martial prowess, and that the romantic mythology developed during peace serves different purposes than historical accuracy. All these insights don't diminish appreciation for either the genuine martial skills of historical warriors or the cultural value of traditions that developed during peace. Rather, the recognition of complexity and of divergence between historical reality and romantic tradition enriches understanding by revealing both how warfare actually functioned and how cultures create meaningful traditions that serve present needs even when they diverge from historical realities they claim to preserve.